Hello everybody, welcome back. I hope you're doing well. This is David back with you. Right, so we have a reading on stress testing, and to set the scene here, what I've done is just to remember that, as you know, part FRM is just been cut into two, I suppose, where you have FRM part 1 and FRM part 2. And sometimes I notice that in part 1 they give you more of a kind of like, this is what's coming up later on in FRM. And so here in this stress testing reading, they're kind of giving us a bit of just an introduction, I suppose. And most of the stress testing appears in part 2. So I wanted to set the scene, I suppose, of what's coming up here, just linked to a variety of areas, guys, that are coming up later in your program here in part 2. Now, we do have some stress testing in part 1 as well. And if you go back to, guys, foundations and go back to enterprise risk management reading number 8, I'm going to draw your attention to a couple of things as we go through that you have seen before in the very first book. But in terms of the scope of stress testing, well, we're going to see it in the FRM program in the area of credit risk. And there are readings all about the counterparty credit risk. And these all came in post-crisis. The 2008 crisis we're talking about here, subprime, the spectacular failure in terms of counterparty credit risk when you think about, for example, AIG. So lots of focus in FRM Part 2 on counterparty credit risk and stress testing as well. Stress testing expected losses, stress testing the credit valuation adjustments, all that kind of stuff's been stress tested. Now, in the operational risk book, operational risk and resilience, there are lots of readings about resilience. You know, the idea of a firm maybe being hit by all kinds of extreme events, being hit by, for example, obviously pandemics at the moment, and the idea of bending but not breaking. And so from both the kind of people, processes, systems, and an external event perspective, and also from a cyber perspective as well, the idea of stress testing what can happen. So massive areas at the moment, of course, with the pandemic. We'll talk more about that as we go through this area. And then when you get to specific areas like stress testing, banks, we're going to have a look at the idea, guys, of since the crisis, that the evolution of stress testing has certainly evolved quite a bit, and look at some of the changes that have been happening there, and also the models that we use as well, validating and using risk models there, stress testing these too. And then we have a brand new book in the last couple of years. Liquidity and treasury risk has its own book, no longer kind of combined with operational risk. And again, we have liquidity stress testing coming in as well. And then finally, in FRM Part 2, guys, for this season, and we have climate risk readings as well, the idea of stress testing here. So when we look at the big picture about stress testing, we are going to see that the first place to start, I suppose, would be what our risk factors are. So we have that on the right here. What are the risk factors? Talk about mapping. Whenever I think about mapping risk factors, one of the first things that comes to mind for me in this chapter is, I suppose, long-term capital management, where they had, lots and lots of individual positions in different markets, but weren't they linked to common risk factors? Weren't you heavily linked to credit spreads, for example, there? And so you found, although you had lots of positions, you were heavily concentrated in one particular style or factor in this way. So to put this chapter in context, on the left-hand side, the sensitivity analysis is the idea of looking at small changes. So guys, DV01, looking at 1 basis point, or credit spread 01, often split into a half a basis point in either direction.